Well, I mean, we're all in the middle of COVID, aren't we? And we are also, do you remember those bushfires? Do you remember the bushfires and how it was the end of the world back then? It's extraordinary, isn't it? But really when you looked at our response to the bushfires and you look at our response to COVID and you think about the debate about what should we do, so much of our response, confirming Mike's survey, is that we think we need laws. Think about all the laws that have been introduced to separate you at the moment, right? That's all the result of a law, isn't it? And the idea is that it's going to help us avoid the bad effects of the virus. And to an extent, that makes really good sense, doesn't it? But the other thing is, you probably have noticed, is that when we're thinking about COVID, we're also trying to nut things out, and we recognise that we need to educate people about careful behaviours. So it's not all law, is it? We sort of say, well, learn to sort of sneeze into your elbow or something, or bump elbows. Sorry, maybe I shook hands tonight with a few people, but you know, the sort of like education seems to be a really key way of approaching it. But I think when we examine these questions of law and education, we've got to ask ourselves, what do we mean? And so I want to actually put it to you first as a bit of a thought experiment. Just in your mind, ask yourself, how would I define law? And how would I define education? And if you're online, you might like to type it in and you can have a little discussion and ignore what I'm saying if you like. Very distracting, isn't it? But how would you define law? Think about that for a while. What is law? Do you ever ask that question of yourself? Well, legal philosophers have come up with lots of definitions, but they can be broken down into two basic approaches. Let me explain the first one, because I think it sheds some light on what we mean by law and why we might expect that law could help to create a better society. The first view is that law is essentially a command by a sovereign. And a sovereign is someone who has power to enforce their commands. And so the idea is, and really the COVID rules have been very much like that, their decrees sit like that. And why are we all doing it? Because we recognise the authority of the government. But on this definition and approach to law, the ultimate reason this is law is that when it really comes down to it, to put it a little bit in an edgy way, the police might well walk in this door and double check that we're actually complying. And if we're not, someone could get in serious trouble. So that's a very famous account or theory of law. A very famous American lawyer called Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. called this, or said that this approach to law amounts to what he called a bad man theory of law. Why did he call it a bad man theory of law? Well, it's the viewpoint about what law is from the perspective of a bad man. And law is what a bad man will do in response to a decree. And what will a bad man do? Obey to the extent the bad man thinks they're going to get caught or they're going to suffer some consequence. But not necessarily anything more than that, because apart from that, the bad man is just going to do what they want to do, what's in their own interests, what reflects their own desires. Now, if that's what law is, law can do significant good, but only in a negative sense, because it can cause a bad person, which actually when you think about it is all of us in a sense. It can motivate all of us to not do really bad things. But do you see how it's negative? It doesn't actually turn you into a good person or motivate you to do good things. It just scares you from doing bad things if you're going to get caught. But it will only be effective insofar as we're bad people, to the extent that we think we're going to get caught. And if we can get away with it at that red light at 1 a.m. in the morning, we may well, none of you would, I know, but I think you know what I'm talking about here, about how much we will obey depending on whether we think we'll get caught. Now, if this is what law is, it has an interesting consequence. And that is that if you want to use law to create a good society, what do you have to do to cause bad people to do good? Well, you have to multiply law upon law upon law in excruciating detail, so that all of the possible decisions you might make are controlled by this law. And on top of that, you have to regulate people and supervise people to make sure that they're going to comply, so that they know they'll get caught if they break the rules. What sort of a society emerges as a result of the view that law in this sense could actually create a good society? It could actually produce a pretty bad and scary society. Partly because the rules might become so cumbersome and in such excruciating detail that we're put into tied up, as it were, in a straitjacket with very little room to move. And in addition, it creates a different mentality in our heads, because we're not going to like the law because it's just controlling us too much. It has interesting consequences. And the other consequence is that even us lawyers, the law becomes so complex and detailed, we can't even keep up with the law. I mean, have any of you seen the Income Tax Assessment Act? Right? You've had to deal with it, right? How big is it? It's enormous. It's multiple volumes. And I don't think all tax lawyers understand it all. Has anyone seen the corporations law? It's enormous. These laws are not thousands, but many thousands of pages long. Why? Because of the bad man theory of law, and partly an expectation that law is going to make a good society. So we just have to make another law to correct, because there's a loophole. There's always a loophole in the law, and you've got to close it with another law, but then you've created another loophole. I think you see the point. And that's the consequence of law. And the amount of law that we have is just blown up considerably. Now, there's a second definition of law. It's actually the definition of law that one of my heroes, Augustine of Hippo, many centuries ago proposed. Because he once said this: you know, when I think about it, an unjust law would seem to be no law at all. It's a very interesting statement. It's actually a paradox. It's actually almost a contradiction. An unjust law would seem to be no law at all. I'll let you ponder that one. What he's proposing is that justice, the morality of the law, is intrinsic to the nature of law. That's very different from the first definition, which says that law is a command of a sovereign, and a sovereign is the one with the big stick that you fear will punish you. It's a different definition. It's saying that we know what law is because it's an ordinance of justice promulgated by those who have the care of the community, as Thomas Aquinas said. Now, if law is this, then the effectiveness of the law does not depend on the crabbed and miserly attitude of the bad man, who will only do what the law requires and not an iota more. Because if justice is intrinsic to the nature of law, then the law itself expresses the good purposes it's trying to achieve. And it doesn't have to spell out in excruciating detail all of the little nitty-gritties, on the assumption that you're dealing with good people. Because a good person will understand the good purposes in a law and pursue them. The law will give them some guidance, like, yeah, better stay however many metres apart from each other that you need to. But the good-heartedness of the people who organised tonight wanted to make sure that not only did they comply with the letter of the law, but they wanted to do it in the right spirit of the law. That's a very different perspective about law. Consider this, that the consequence of that view is that law can be a lot more simple. Consider the simplicity of the 10 Commandments. Only 10 rules. Consider the two greatest commandments. Love God and love your neighbour. 2 rules, right? A perfectly good person probably doesn't need any more law. and that's the key. So we're in a tension really between two theories of law. And what a far cry from that simple idea of law as justice have we come when we consider the reams upon reams of laws that are enacted every day. One really profound writer that I love very much by the name of Oliver O'Donovan, some of you may know of him, he called it an incessant stream of lawmaking. Now, given this preoccupation with law, we ask ourselves, well, is that really the answer? Or are we expecting too much of law? And so we turn to education as an alternative theory about making a good society, because prevention seems to us to be better than a cure. But what is education? And here, once again, I want to propose to you two definitions. Stop and ask yourself for a minute, what is education? What do you think it is? Well, here's one definition. I could call it a pragmatic or practical definition of education. That education is about the transmission of knowledge and the development of skills. Does that ring any bells? The goal of education on this view is to fill children's heads with facts and equip their hands with practical skills. Education exists to generate the next generation of workers, where each person will fulfill their role within the society. Now, this has its advantages, because the more we know and the more skilled we are, the better we are able to serve each other with those particular skills. I'm very glad we have engineers, and I'm very glad we have medical doctors. I'm not so sure that I'm glad we have... No, I won't go down that path. But we do recognise this, don't we, that those skills are very valuable. But here's the thing about knowledge and skill. It doesn't necessarily produce good people. It merely produces people who are clever and skillful. And that's good so long as it's accompanied by good character and good purposes. But without good character, intelligence, knowledge and skill are actually dangerous. I'd rather be governed, I think, by a stupid good person than a clever evil person. That's putting it pretty strongly, maybe too strongly, but I think you get the point I'm trying to make. Now, nonetheless, we tend to think as a society that if we just knew more and we were more skilled, we could build a better society. But I'm not so sure that that's the case. I think the problem goes deeper than that, and that sort of a view of education is too superficial. Take this commonplace belief in our society, that the better educated you are, the more intelligent you are, the more likely you're going to form your views based on well-established evidence and careful logical reasoning. And the corollary, the more ignorant you are, the less well-educated you are, the more likely you are to be driven by emotion, prejudice, superstition and dogma. Well, they are very well highly shared views. However, the cognitive and behavioural science literature suggests that this simply is not the case. Rather, as one author put it, those who are highly educated, intelligent or rhetorically skilled tend to be significantly less likely than most to revise their beliefs or adjust their positions when confronted with evidence or arguments that contradict their prior beliefs. Swallow that for a bit. This is the result of empirical studies on the behaviour of intelligent people and well-educated people. And it's a curious, even shocking finding. And how could it be so? Well, here's one plausible explanation. Clever, well-educated people are better skilled at responding to uncomfortable facts and challenging arguments. They use their highly refined critical abilities to scrutinise others and their beliefs rather than themselves and their own beliefs. Now, this is something that applies especially to academics like me. Despite all of our critical abilities, it seems that we academics, and the literature seems to suggest this is the case too, we tend to be more ideological, more ideologically rigid, and more ideologically extreme in our beliefs. And in fact, more likely to be prejudiced against other people who do not share our beliefs. That's an empirically supported proposition from the literature. It's not a very flattering self-portrait. How could it be so? Well, perhaps the answer lies in better education. And here lies a second definition of education. And it's an ancient one. Education is not just about knowledge and skills, it's about the inculcation of wisdom and virtue. It's about the formation of good habits. It's about qualities like honesty, integrity, self-discipline, and generosity. It involves the development of intellectual virtues like curiosity, attentiveness, fair-mindedness, humility, imaginativeness, courage and perseverance. A recent report commissioned by the New South Wales Government has underscored the importance of character in education. The report observes that there's been a decline in institutions in our society that support the development of good character in our young people. And in this context, many submissions to this inquiry urge the government to consider ways to develop good character in our students. They spoke of their mindsets, their values, their attitudes, and their dispositions, and that these are the important outcomes of education. And I believe that this is a very good thing. But when I read the submissions closely, I noticed the language they used. The key attributes they said we need to instill in our students are more knowledge and deeper understanding and greater discernment. Think about that. They still were thinking the key was more knowledge. But is that quite right? An ancient philosopher by the name of Plato, you may have heard of him, taught that that's not quite right. That true education requires a conversion of the soul. But in what does this conversion of the soul consist? For Plato and his teacher Socrates, it involves an illumination of the soul. Because for them, knowledge is the solution to our problems. Because our essential problem for them is ignorance. They believe that no one ignorantly does what is evil. Evil occurs because people are ignorant of what is good and pursue that which is evil, mistaking it for what is good. And so for them, the remedy lies in more knowledge. And I think a lot of modern education is premised on this idea. We think that if we give children more knowledge and better understanding, they will take what is good and pursue it. But is this true to reality? Think again of that class of people who are the most educated in our society. Do these people live in a manner that is more virtuous than the less well educated? I rather doubt it. I work amongst them. And I see it in myself. Indeed, it's quite possible that these people are more inclined to overestimate their virtues and underestimate their vices. And why might this be so? I come back to Augustine of Hippo. He had a word for it. He called it pride. And so we come to religion. Now, as with law and education, I think it's possible to distinguish two definitions of religion. So ask yourself for a moment, how would you define religion? How would you define it? Well, one approach to defining religion is the definitions you find in the disciplines of anthropology, sociology, politics and law. In these disciplines, we encounter attempts to develop general definitions of religion that are sufficiently inclusive to include everything that should be a religion, but sufficiently incisive only to talk about or capture religion and not to include philosophical beliefs that aren't religious. if you stop and think about that, and I could illustrate that with later in questions if you like, it's actually very hard to come up with a definition of religion that isn't itself as controversial as religion itself. And yet, this approach to religion underlies anthropological, sociological, political and legal approaches to religion and its study. But it's hard to define religion without adopting a particular viewpoint. So the other thing to note about this approach to religion, that it's actually a modern invention. It was invented a few centuries ago as part of an attempt to replace what we would call religious interpretations of reality with secular ones, to explain, reduce and redefine religious phenomena as religious. But it's only able to do that using a subterfuge in the definitions. Now, let me explain how this sort of works in law. Section 116 of the Australian Constitution provides for freedom of religion and that there should be no establishment of religion in our country. But it all turns on the meaning of religion, the meaning of freedom, and the meaning of what it means to establish a religion. In Australia, religion has been defined in this way. Think about this definition. It involves belief in a supernatural being, thing or principle, and acceptance of canons of conduct, rules of conduct that give effect to those beliefs. And existence of a group that has those beliefs and follows that conduct. Now, notice something about that definition. It suggests that religion is nothing other than a special type of law and a special type of education. It involves beliefs and it involves practices according to rules of conduct. Interesting. The definition of religion is really a definition of law and education, so that religion is nothing more than those things. Now, to me, that's very significant and very important limitation in that definition of religion. So what I want to propose to you, coming to the conclusion, is an alternative, second approach to defining religion. And I want to focus on the old Latin word from which our modern idea of religion comes, a word called religio, which conceives religion not so much as a system of beliefs and practices, law and education as it were, but as a virtue or quality of character, a moral virtue by which you render to God that which is properly owed to God. Now, this is a religious understanding of religion. Admittedly, it is. But it's not clear that this definition is any more neutral than a secular definition of religion. They're both inherently controversial. And what's really interesting is that a recent study has shown that religious people might well be more tolerant of people of other religions than secular people. Now, that's not what you expect to think. But Professor Jonathan Fox, a professor from Bar Ilan University in Tel Aviv, in Israel, recently published a book which examined the extent to which there is religious discrimination in the world in 183 countries of the world. And one of the startling conclusions he came to was this, that when very carefully analysed, the Western secular countries of the world, like Australia, actually engage in more religious discrimination than numerous Christian majority, but not Western and not secular countries of South America, Asia and Africa. Yet we Westerners think we are the paragons of tolerance towards religion. Fascinating and challenging and profound book. Now, understanding religion as religio, as a virtue, brings it into conversation with approaches to education that are interested in creating or inculcating good character. Socrates and Plato, as I said, recognise that the development of good character requires a conversion of the soul. But they thought our inherent and underlying problem was a deficiency of mind, not a defect of will. Augustine begged to differ. He believed that true religio requires a conversion of the soul that goes further than anything Socrates or Plato imagined. Because his proposition was this: the human soul is not naturally moved towards the good. The fundamental problem that we have in our society is a problem that we have, each one of us. It's not a deficiency of our minds or our intellects, it's a defect of our wills. We have an inclination, if you really examine yourself, to self-justification, and a tendency to judge others more harshly than we judge ourselves. Augustine believed that human pride is the root of all our problems, and that humility must be the first and essential step towards our moral improvement. He offered a striking image. This is why he's such a wonderful writer. He spoke of this wonderful queen, which he called pleasure, sitting on a throne, surrounded by the virtues, ready to do whatever she might command. What did he mean when he said this? That pleasure might have virtues arrayed, ready to do whatever she commands. His point was this, that if we really examine our motives deeply, we can often adopt virtuous practices, but not out of the goodness of our hearts, and not even for the good of other people necessarily, but only as means of bolstering our pride. Or at least, even at our best moments, how very readily we are inclined to become proud of our goodness. And when we are caught in the grip of that pride, what becomes more important is not actually how good we are, but how good other people think we are. And so we have a tendency to do things so that we will appear to be good, but not necessarily be good when no one is watching. We're still like that bad man that Justice Holmes talked about, the bad man theory of law. Pride can motivate us to do good things, or at least to appear to be good. That's why pride is the deepest root of our problems. Our desire for glory and honour often motivates us to appear to be good or to be good. This is a disturbing teaching, but I propose to you that it's the teaching of religion or religio properly and best understood. And religion in this sense goes further than education because it forces us to ask deep questions about our motives. It forces us to self-examination, and it challenges us to confess and repent. Not just about our outward actions that people catch us out on, but to repent of our darkest inward thoughts and desires. And it sets before us a model, not of self-justification and rationalisation and pointing the finger at other people's bad behaviour, but of candid acknowledgement of our own failures. And it presses us to admit that we're in need of forgiveness and that we need to forgive each other. And so on this account, religion is more than mere education, and it is much more than mere law. Education without religion can only inform the mind and train the hand. It cannot convert the soul. Law without religion can only require outward conformity and punish when there's disobedience or when people get caught. It cannot redirect the heart. Law and education therefore need to leave room for religion so that religion can do what it alone is capable of doing, softening the heart and redirecting the will. An education system that recognises this will leave room for religion. A legal system that recognises this will leave room for religion. The 5th century desert father and Coptic monk, the Abba Poem, put it best when he said this, and I quote, "It is more important that a teacher be an example to his students than merely to instruct them with words and exercises. Be their example," he said, "not their legislator." And it seems to me that that is a profound truth that applies to us all. Thank you.